Welcome. I'm Vivian Bercovici, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and this is a big day for the state of Tel Aviv and beyond. We are launching our YouTube channel now with this video, and the first interview is with Professor Gad Sa'ad. Gad Sa'ad really needs no introduction as one of the most influential public intellectuals globally who has led the growing blowback against the twisted mind culture that has pervaded liberal democracies in the West. His recent book, The Parasitic Mind, is an international bestseller, and if you haven't read it, you really should. By the way, it was just translated into Hebrew and is receiving rave reviews. The book focuses on what has been happening and how can we fix things. A professor at Montreal's Concordia University, Gad Sa'ad is on leave this year and has joined Michigan's Northwood University as a visiting professor and global ambassador. You can see his full bio at stateoftelaviv.com. That's all one word, stateoftelaviv.com. I spoke with Gad Sa'ad on Tuesday, December 10th. We got into a lot. Post-October 7th Jew hatred, why Canada has become one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the Western world. Like, what the heck is going on there? And we have a lot of fun discussing his recent week at Mar-a-Lago and the red velvet jacket. The jacket is a big scoop. So let's get to Gad. Thank you for being here. We will be dropping content regularly on this YouTube channel. Please subscribe, share, ring the bell, and check out stateoftelaviv.com for podcasts and articles from May 2022. All right, let's do this.
Dr. Gad Sa'ad, it's so wonderful to have you on the State of Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us today.
Such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
And I have to tell our listeners and viewers, this is our first full audiovisual podcast, broadcast, and I am coming to you from the Norman Hotel in Tel Aviv, which is a fabulous location.
So I'm currently in Montreal, but as we discussed off air, officially, I've taken a 1-year leave from Concordia University, and I'm a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University, which is a really nice university in Michigan.
And there's a lot to talk about what's going on in Montreal these days, in Canada and Toronto. We have a lot to pack into this hour. I want to start, though, with the fact that your book, The Parasitic Mind, which is a huge global bestseller. How many copies?
Oh, many. So it's hard to tell because sometimes when you sell the foreign rights to a country, let's say to China or to Bulgaria, I may not know the number of copies sold in that country. And so the number that I'm going to give you is going to be a gross underestimate. It's certainly in the many hundreds of thousands.
Okay. How many languages? Can you give me that?
Yeah. So here's another little asterisk. Sometimes what happens is that a foreign publisher buys the foreign rights, but then they never end up publishing it. So I know that close to, I think, 25 foreign rights have been purchased, but not all of which have subsequently been published, but around 20 would be the right number.
And your Hebrew edition, the Hebrew edition of The Parasitic Mind, has just been released, correct?
Indeed, that is true.
And I think that your book is going to do exceptionally well here, not just because I've been reading comments about it. You've been picked up by what is considered to be the sort of, top publishing house for important books in the country. You share a publisher with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
I'm sure he feels very honored by that.
I'm sure he does. And what's interesting is that we don't have the same degree of mind pathogens in Israel, in my view, that we see in other Western countries, certainly Canada, which is where you and I have both lived for most of our adult lives. So we'll just park that observation, but I do want to get back to it when we sort of start delving into the Middle East, because there's something there, and I'm not sure what it is. I have an idea, I'm not sure. But The mind pathogen. Tell us what the mind pathogen is.
Well, so let me give you the background. So I'm an evolutionary behavioral scientist, meaning that I study the biological roots of what makes us tick, why we behave the way that we do. Now, one of the tools within the arsenal of toolboxes of an evolutionary psychologist is you often engage in what's called comparative psychology. You compare human behavior to some of our animal cousins to see if there is evolutionary continuity. So our primate cousins may engage in a certain behavior that's identical to how we behave, and that's how we have an idea that there is an evolutionary link between us and them. Now, why am I saying all this? So as I was trying to think about what was causing this great war on reason that we were seeing, up is down, left is right, nothing made sense, I thought, well, let me delve into the animal literature. Hence, this is why I introduced it as such. I wanted to see whether there was a field that explored irrational, erratic behavior, suicidal behavior in other species. And that's when I fell upon the field of neuroparasitology. Now, parasitology is the study of parasites and parasite-host interactions. Neuroparasites is when the parasite ends up in the host's brain. So, for example, a tapeworm parasitizes your intestinal tract, whereas a neuroparasite goes to your brain, typically altering your behavior to suit its interests. So let me give you an example, and then this is kind of the big background, okay? So take, for example, a wood cricket. It's a type of cricket, an insect, that the wood cricket abhors, it detests water. It wants to stay as far away from water as possible. But when it is parasitized by a specific brainworm, a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water in order for it to complete its reproductive cycle, right? And therefore, when a wood cricket is parasitized by this particular brain parasite, it merrily jumps and commits suicide to its detriment, but in the service of the parasite. And so I had my epiphany, I now had found the biological mechanism or metaphor to argue that human beings can be parasitized by actual brainworms, but they could be parasitized by a second class of brainworms. I call those idea pathogens. And so in the same way that Toxoplasma gondii is an actual brain parasite that can infect human brains, parasites like postmodernism, cultural relativism, social constructivism, political correctness, identity politics, all biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain human behavior, all of these collections of ideological parasites can lead us to become like the wood cricket, jumping into the abyss of infinite lunacy and merrily committing suicide. So that's the general framework.
Except that the way in which you apply this pathogen idea concept to human beings is metaphorical, correct? In the wood cricket, it's actually, there's a real biological thing that's going on.
Exactly. So here, these are ideological mind pathogens. They're idea pathogens. But in a sense, I mean, by the way, I've had doctoral students and postdocs that approach me to actually study the neural mechanisms that result in all of the things that I'm talking about. So for example, can we do functional magnetic resonance imaging of brains of people who are either ideologically captured or those that have the inoculation against this type of thinking? So ultimately, everything that you do, all of your thinking is biological based, it's material based. But yes, to your point, you're right that I'm using it as a biological metaphor to explain the behavior.
I'm just curious, though, that now that you've raised these doctoral students and postdocs, has anyone actually done that research?
So with one of my graduate students, who regrettably has disappeared on me, as often happens with graduate students, I sought to empirically test several features in my book, The Parasitic Mind. So, for example, and this may take us in a unique direction. One of the things that I talk about in the Parasitic Mind is actually something that comes from zoology. Am I able to use a spicy term, but that's actually from zoology on your show?
Absolutely. Spice it up.
Okay, so the formal term is kleptogamy, but the more colloquial term, albeit in the scientific literature, is called the sneaky fucker strategy. Now, in a second, I'll explain how I apply it in the Parasitic Mind and how this particular doctoral student was going to empirically work on this project with me. So the sneaky fucker strategy is a strategy found in some species where you have two male phenotypes. One male is the prototypical male, dominant, big, intimidating. And the other male is actually not masculine looking and tries to pretend to look as though he is female and approach the dominant male so that dominant male can be tricked into thinking that sneaky fucker is actually a female, lets him through, and then he sneakily has sex with many of the females that the big male is protecting. So, and this happens in several species. Classically, it happens in some fish species. And so this became known in the 70s in the zoological literature, as I said, as the sneaky fucker strategy. Again, that shows you how studying other animal behavior can be very helpful in understanding things in the human context. So given the fact that I knew of this particular zoological mating strategy, I had another one of those eureka moments where I said, well, I think that male feminists are engaging in the sneaky fucker strategy in the human context. Look how sensitive I am. Look how empathetic I am. I wear a really cool foulard. I hug the trees a lot. You don't have to worry about me. I'm very non-threatening. And this is how I hopefully can have sexual access to you. Okay. Well, I wanted to then test that theory empirically. Well, how would you go about testing that theory, Vivian, empirically? Well, I can actually give subjects photos of muscular men versus photos of what might be considered male feminist sneaky fuckers to then see whether people are able to accurately predict people's political orientations by their morphological features. Are you with me so far?
I'm so with you. You know what I'm thinking. You know what I'm thinking. You know who I'm thinking of.
You're thinking about Justin Trudeau as the ultimate male sneaky fucker.
Cha-ching.
That's why I'm Gad Sa'ad. So I set up, I gave him the whole design, the whole thing. He went off, apparently collected the data. I'm excited to now delve into the data. And as often happens with these graduate students, they disappear. Because this is a side note, when a graduate student is starting to work on a thesis with you, it's really the first time where in their educational career, they're not learning material that is presented to them passively, where they actually have to go out and generate the knowledge. Now, for many graduate students, they perform wonderfully well at that, whereas other students end up getting sucked into a black hole of which they never come out. That's why some doctoral students will take 7, 8, 10 years to finish a PhD. Not because it was uniquely difficult. I mean, you should be able to finish a PhD in, 4 to 6 years, but they end up getting sucked and they never come out. And so to answer your question in a very long-winded, but hopefully interesting way, I have several empirical studies with graduate students that have thus far not come to fruition, but maybe they'll resurface and we can publish it.
I certainly hope they do resurface. I think it'd be fascinating to read about. The mind pathogen. You have lived the mind pathogen for the last number of years, at least a decade. Justin Trudeau has been empowering Canada for almost 10 years. And I would suggest that he is the poster boy for the mind pathogen and every form of woke and campus and social lunacy that we can think of. I'll throw your suicidal empathy category in there as well. I mean, he's just an embarrassment of riches that never stops giving. And, It used to be, we Canadians were kind of looking around thinking, what is happening? It took most Canadians a little too long to figure it out. But now it's like the sluice has been opened. The whole world has figured it out. The whole world is looking at Canada now and saying, what the hell is going on there? And you, in fact, for many years have been teaching at Concordia University, which has become the showcase for this kind of insanity.
Indeed. So a couple of
what's going on because this is all related to your book and how you analyze society and these crazy norms that have been imposed on us from out of nowhere. Diversity is our strength, being one of my favorites. But you've been in the belly of the beast at Concordia and in Montreal. How does this happen?
Right. So I want to find a prop. I don't have one here. Imagine for a second, maybe you've seen me do this before. Are you familiar with my getting drunk by smelling the cork of the wine bottle saying? Do you know that? Have you heard me say this? No.
I have not. And I'm feeling terrible at it.
No. I didn't need to put you on the spot.
I've been exposed. I have not heard that.
No. So imagine that this is the cork of a wine bottle. Okay. And so there's an expression from Arabic that basically says, getting drunk by smelling the cork of the wine bottle, which refers to the fact that you're of weak constitution, right? Look, I'm going to get drunk now. See, I'm getting drunk. I didn't have to actually drink the bottle to get drunk. I just took a whiff and I'm already tipsy. Now, I apply that mechanism to explain how people can be drunk by affective cues, by cosmetic cues, by peripheral cues. So what does that mean? Look now I can apply it to Justin Trudeau, but let's first apply it to the American context. Now I'm going to smell the cork of Barack Obama. He is tall. He has a mellifluous voice. Look, I'm getting drunk. He has a radiant smile. He speaks with the cadence of a Southern Baptist minister, even though every single syllable that he's ever uttered is a platitudinal sack of bullshit. But yet I am drunk by smelling the cosmetic cues. On the other hand, Donald Trump, he's cantankerous. He's an ogre. He's mean. He speaks in a brash and brazen way. So at no point did I say, I love Barack Obama for the following monetary policies or immigration policies or tax policies or domestic policies. That would be too much for me because I would have to engage in something called thinking. It's much better to simply get drunk by smelling the cork of the wine bottle. On the other hand, if people say they hate Donald Trump, they didn't say they hate Donald Trump for these substantive reasons. They only look at the cosmetic cues. Now, why is it so that the architecture of the human mind is so easily prone to succumb to getting drunk by smelling the cork of the wine bottle? Because in a world filled with computational complexity, I have to find a way to apply a heuristic, a shortcut to cut through the clutter. And so by using affective processing, emotional-based processing, it gets me to make a decision without having to do the hard effort of actually thinking. This is why I call human beings, they're cognitive misers, right? They're lazy in pursuing any sort of intellectual heavy lifting. Now, to come to your point about Justin Trudeau, he is the ultimate manifestation, as you exactly pointed out. I've been saying this for many years, that he is the epitome, the exemplar of every idea pathogen that I discussed in the Parasitic Mind. But to my point about the getting drunk by smelling the cork of the wine bottle, most of the Canadians who succumb to Justin Trudeau, not once, not twice, but 3 times, it's because he's tall, he's young, he says complete nonsense, but it just seems like he's sweet. He's got nice hair. Now, I know it's become cliche to say this, but believe me, Vivian, and I know you know this, many of my middle-aged female colleagues, if you saw how they were reacting on my personal Facebook page If it had been the other way around, had it been male colleagues reacting to a female politician that way, it would have been a hashtag Me Too moment. But he was dreamy. He was so gorgeous. He was exciting. He was fun. Again, it never had anything to do with his policies, but he was exciting. And so that's what happened. People are easily manipulated by this nonsense. That's why politicians, when they go on the campaign, they hold the baby, right? Anybody with the most minimal intelligence would recognize that this is just a cosmetic hue. Look, I'm caring, I'm empathetic, I'm approachable, I'm paternalistic or mother instinct. It's nonsense. It's all cosmetic packaging. And regrettably, Canadians fell for it for the past 9 years.
Did they ever? And I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, you and I are similar kind of age and stage. We grew up in different parts of the world for a period of time, but in similar environments from when I understand you're in your teens. I didn't fall for it. I didn't fall for the Justin Trudeau, pathogens. In fact, I was repelled. I was repulsed by it from day one. And I look around in Canada, I look around in the United States at the way many Americans swooned over Barack Obama, and I ask, why? What changed? Because you're explaining how it happens, but what's happening now, and I would suggest for the last 10, 15 years, has been kind of, building this momentum, is very different from the way the world was in the 70s, in the 80s, even in the 90s. So what about our societies and our minds, our beings, has changed to allow us to succumb?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I think the capacity for the human mind to be parasitized is not something that is specific to this era. So to your question, I can go back throughout all of human history and demonstrate that regrettably, the architecture of the human mind doesn't have built-in inoculation to not be parasitized. So for example, 300 years ago, we thought that it was a really good idea if we thought that the neighbor was a witch, that we would throw her in water. And if she swam, if she didn't drown, then that proved that she was a witch. But if she did drown and then died, oh, oops, I guess she wasn't a witch. And we thought that that was a wonderful way to adjudicate these types of decisions. Today, we look at that parasitic thinking and go, my God, what the hell were these idiots thinking? But to your question, what is unique about the current period is that all of these parasitic ideas, which took 50 to 100 years to be spawned on university campuses and then to escape from the university campuses, have now come home to roost. So they result in Justin Trudeau. But the idea pathogens took many, many years before they were able to escape and become our journalists and our prime ministers and so on. By the way, this speaks to an important point that I would often get in response to me standing on top of the mountain and warning people. People would say, come on, Professor Sa'ad, aren't you exaggerating? I mean, there's some silly ideas in some, humanities department, in some, highfalutin ivory tower, but who cares about that? I said, what? And I would literally say, yes, it starts off in that ivory tower, but then it will escape that lab, to use the biological metaphor. And that's exactly what happened. So what is unique to the current period is the unique idea pathogens that have all come together. So that's part one. Those idea pathogens that I discussed in the Parasitic Mind hijacked our cognitive system, our ability to think. My next book, Suicidal Empathy, completes the story by then arguing that human beings are both a thinking and feeling animal. Suicidal empathy parasitizes our emotional system. It hijacks our emotional system. Once you put those two grand parasitic realities together, you get exactly the unique current reality that you asked about, right? So it becomes orgiastically most important for me to demonstrate that I'm infinitely tolerant, infinitely empathetic, infinitely compassionate, without ever recognizing that evolution did not endow us with the desire to indiscriminately ascribe empathy to anyone, right? So, for example, evolutionarily speaking, you and I have evolved the emotional system that causes us to be willing to jump in front of a truck to save our biological children, much more so than random children. That doesn't mean that we wish for random children to be hurt, but we do strategically met out our investments, our risk taking in line with our evolutionary interests. But now imagine if there could be a parasite that removes that ability to discriminate. As a matter of fact, it creates a perverse form of empathy. Guatemalan illegal immigrants are more important than American vets. That demonstrates that I've truly transcended vulgar empathy. I am globalist. I'm above it, right? Recognizing that criminals have been victimized by society, and therefore, why should I punish them through the penal system? That would be doubly punishing them, is part of suicidal empathy. So put all that together, Vivian, and you get the unique realities that we're facing today.
Okay, and speaking of unique realities that we're facing today, October 7th. So there was one world on October 6th, and then October 7th happened. By late afternoon in Toronto and Montreal, I was in Toronto on October 7, 2023. And by late afternoon, when Hamas was still savaging and slaughtering its way through Israel, there were celebrations, open celebrations on the streets of Montreal and Toronto. And we have seen in the ensuing 14 months the utter breakdown of both our cities. I'm from Toronto. You've spent much of your adult life in Montreal. We are now looked at around the world as being an absolute gutter of pro-Hamas hatred, anti-Semitic violence, and a lot of mind pathogens are swirling around in that mix. And on top of that, we have the suicidal empathy, which is way too kind, if you ask me, of our prime minister, who is just not dealing with anything real. Help unpack what has gone on in Canada since October 7th. And for our American and European listeners, Canada has become in many ways the petri dish for the world. We have become the laboratory. We have gone from being what seemed to be a civilized, tolerant, kind of nice place to live to a hellhole.
Yes, so a lot to unpack there. So after October 7th, so, I've seen it all when it comes to Jew hatred. I come from Lebanon, right? So, I mean, we had to wear really good running shoes and run really fast so that our heads were not detached from the rest of our bodies. So few people have lived their Jewish identities more than my family and I have done so. And so I thought I had seen it all until post-October 7th, where then I faced a tsunami of Jew hatred that is difficult to comprehend. So you would think, so there's a lot to unpack here, so please bear with me as I try to cover it in different ways. So I always tell people that many phenomena can take one of three possible states of the world. So for example, if I am trying to lose weight, depending on the actions that I take in a given day, which food I eat, how much I move, only three things can happen to my weight at the end of that day. There isn't a fourth one. Either my weight goes up, either my weight stays exactly the same, or my weight goes down. There is no other state, yes? Well, after October 7th, if I were to ask any decent human being, so after this orgy of killing of 1,200 Jews, do you think that the world will see a rise in Jew hatred, no change in Jew hatred, or a decrease in Jew hatred? Many people would say, well, certainly there should be a decrease in Jew hatred because there might be some empathy and sympathy that is built to what just happened to Jewish people. To my surprise, and it takes a lot to surprise me as a student of human behavior, I was astonished to see that there was an orgiastic increase in Jew hatred that came from three sources. And I'm going to come in a second to Montreal and Canada. The three sources of Jew hatred that I was facing, but that could certainly be expanded to anyone else, there was the neo-Nazi type of Jew hatred. Jews won't replace us types. Okay. There was the academic progressive left Jew haters that have been inculcated, indoctrinated, brainwashed, parasitized by the Jews are colonizers, Palestinians are noble, peaceful, kind people. And you learn that in every single course you take, not just at Concordia, but also at my alma mater, Cornell, and my other alma mater, McGill, and at York, where you're, and everywhere else, there is a particular narrative. So that then also creates built-in Jew hatred. And then the third source is Islamic sources of Jew hatred, which of course I'm intimately familiar with. So now we come to Montreal, specifically, and Canada in general. If you let in, as part of your very suicidally empathetic immigration policy, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who we know based on scientific quantitative surveys, that if you ask people that stem from those societies, what are your views of Jews? Now, let me step back. If I told you that 10% of surveyed people from those countries have endemic Jew hatred in their heart, 10% would be a very problematic number. You'd be like, what, 1 out of 10 hates Jews? That's wow, that's bad. What if I told you that the Pew survey organization, nonpartisan, very well-respected, did such a study in 2010, and that's only one set of data. I could cite you many others, whereby 95 to 99% of surveyed people from those societies had very negative views of Jews. Again, to your listeners, 10% would be a huge problem. It's 95 to 99. Now, does it take a fancy evolutionary psychologist and professor for 31 years to put it all together to say, if you let in 3 million people into your society that stem from such cultures, what do you think is going to happen to Jew hatred in the host society? Is Jew hatred going to go up, stay the same, or go down? So now people are shaking their heads and saying, where is this Jew hatred coming from? If only there was a way for us to know. Well, if I eat French fries 17 times a day and I sit on the couch all day for a month, I should probably not be surprised that I have an increase in weight. It shouldn't take a fancy professor to tell you what's going to be the trajectory of my weight. That's what happened to Montreal, because in Montreal, and by the way, I recently got a lot of hatred coming at me from French Canadians because they didn't like that I wrote in a New York Post article, which I just published a week and a half ago, about the unique reality of anti-Semitism in Montreal. I said, well, the Quebec government has decided that the number one most important thing to do to protect the society is to protect the French language. In the service of pursuing that goal, if we let in hundreds of thousands of people who will eventually decapitate you, as long as prior to the decapitations we say bonjour, then the decapitation is really not that bad, because ultimately the decapitation happened in French, so we protected the society. Of course, people got very upset at that. Usually people get very upset when you tell the truth. And so I suddenly became the lightning rod of the guy who hates French Canadians. Meanwhile, I'm fully Francophone. I speak fluent French, but apparently I'm the enemy of Quebec, not the people who wish to destroy the secularism of Quebec. That's what parasitic thinking is. That's what Montreal has become.
We have, though, since October 7th, one element, which is the imported and virulent Muslim anti-Semitism in Canada. Not just in Canada, of course, we see it in many Western European countries, It's just we've imported the problem more recently in Canada than has Europe. We could have learned from Europe's mistakes. And in fact, even Angela Merkel, who famously brought in about 1 million Muslim migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, has conceded in recent months that perhaps she went a little too far with that one. But it's all a bit late now, isn't it? But one of the things that we saw after October 7th is, in addition to the Muslim anti-Semitism, which no one even wants to acknowledge exists in Canada and in many parts of Western Europe, they're all trying to, and if you dare raise it, you hate Muslims, right? You're an Islamophobe when you call out, as you say, the obvious. But there is also this weird combustion, this convergence of so-called progressive, woke, leftist ideology. In my view, there's absolutely nothing progressive about them, but, they're fascists. And you have these Muslim and various Muslims and Muslim groups and Muslim sympathizers kind of joining forces with these people who, all have pink hair and multiple piercings. Well, most of them do anyhow. They have nothing in common in terms of their base ideologies and how they look at the world and how they move in the world. But they have come together on their hatred of Jews.
Yes. So, again, several ways I can go with this. Number one, they both share a deep hatred of the West. And they think that by going into bed together, they are joining forces in destroying the transphobic, homophobic, slavery-driven, greedy capitalist societies on which the West is built. Of course, the pink-haired people don't realize that once the other folks that they're going to bed with come to power, then they will face what I call a very effective, the Queers for Palestine. There's a very effective gravity-based conversion therapy program in Gaza to cure you of your queerness. It's gravity-based, so it really works well. It's a 100% effective strategy. But again, because they are parasitized, because they are ideologically captured, they're unable to, close the circle of that mechanism. But the reality is that, well, look, there's a book by, I don't know if you know him. Actually, I think he's from York. Jamie Glazoff. You'll be happy that I might have mentioned him. He wrote a book, I think about 10, 15 years ago. I think he got his PhD at maybe York. I could be misspeaking. He's a historian, I think, by training. He wrote a book called United in Hate. To your point, the pink-haired people and the Muslims are joining forces, to destroy the capitalist West. So that's one element. The second element I wanted to talk about is, why is it that Jew hatred exists independently of whether you learned it in Columbia's Near East studies or in Islamic sources? And so here I'm going to propose a universal psychological mechanism. It's not the only explanation for why Jew hatred is so endemic throughout history, but it's certainly an incredibly powerful predictive one. So there is something in psychology called the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is, how do you attribute successes and failures in your life? And it turns out that for most people, other than clinically depressed people, I attribute successes internally and I attribute failures externally. So I did really well on the exam because I'm a very smart guy. Internal attribution. I did very poorly on the exam because Professor Sa'ad is a asshole Jew who treats his students unfairly. So success is because of me, failure is outside of me. Now imagine if I can be given a pill that allows me to explain all of my failures from one cause, externally, right? So if my wife cheated on me and I'm in Lebanon, that's because the Jews are the creators of pornography. And it must have been that my wife saw some pornographic thing that put this libidinal thought in her mind, and that's why she cheated on me. Turns out that I have diabetes, it's because the Jews, who are pretty much controlling all pharmaceutical industries, and they're all the famous physicians, are not allowing the cure to be distributed because Jews are greedy and they want to keep the money. This is what I call the 6 degrees of Jews. For any calamity in 6 or fewer causal steps, can you link it and blame the Jew for it? So imagine if now, throughout history, whenever something bad happens in my society, either at the individual level or the societal level, I can blame the Jew. But the next question might be, but why the Jew, Gad? Why should we use the Jew as the explicative mechanism for why I failed? Well, here I'm going to borrow a term from a friend of mine who's been on my show. She's a professor of Yale in law, and actually the mentor of J.D. Vance, who is the incoming vice president of the United States, Amy Chua. She talks about market dominant minorities, right? So that when they are and I mean, I've talked about that, but although I didn't use that term, Thomas Sowell has talked about that. So it's not a new concept, but the mechanism is that you often have disproportionate power in a host society being controlled by a very, very small minority. You have that in the Far East, you have that in Africa, you have that. Now, Jews happen to be probably the most consistent market dominant minority throughout history. And there are anti-Semitic reasons for that, for why they be, right? So you look at in film industry and law and medicine and academia and Nobel Prizes, those goddamn Jews seem to really be punching way above their weight class. It's not difficult to then, you don't need to be a fancy psychologist to understand why that could have built-in resentment, whether the Jews are in Liberia or the Jews are in Lebanon or the Jews are in Canada. And so that creates a perfect existential mechanism by which I can blame my failure on this really successful market dominant minority. Put all that together and you get Montreal and the current anti-Semitism.
Interesting. I want to now jump to this part of the world, which is where I am in Tel Aviv. And you, of course, were born in Beirut. And I'm pretty sure that you and your family fled during the Lebanon Civil War in 1975. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were there the first year, so that's exactly right.
So, and that it was not easy, the journey to get out. How's that?
That's the understatement of the century, but yes.
Okay, well, I'm glad you got out safely, and your whole family did. And then, did you head directly to Montreal when you
Right. Well, I mean, yes. Although we stopped for one night in Copenhagen, and I remember as if it's yesterday, walking out in Copenhagen and kind of feeling, my God, nobody's going to shoot me, nobody's going to blow my head, and that it had been a while since I could just walk outside without worrying about who was going to kill me. But that only lasted a day, and then the next day we were on our way to Montreal.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that fear that really quite existential, visceral fear that you describe is something that many Jewish people around the world feel these days. And it's not just people who are dressed in Jewish attire or clothing or other accoutrements that mark them for being Jewish. It's also Israelis who happen to be walking down the street in Europe and overheard speaking in Hebrew, who have been assaulted, and we know, what happened in Amsterdam. So I think that, we've got this momentum, and it's a very dangerous momentum that's building globally with respect to Jews. You look, though, at this part of the world and what's going on, which I can't even begin. Why do you think this woke mind virus pathogen all your great terms. Why has it not taken root in Israel?
Right. Well, I mean, I've heard both. I've heard what you've said, that there's been a more built-in inoculation in Israel against the idea pathogens. But I've also heard that many of the super progressive leftist Israeli professors have been parasitized. So which is it? Because I can offer possible explanations to both. Do
So,
we know?
it's actually interesting. And I would say, as a non-academic observer, anecdotally, socially, it's just not taken root. And that it is,
And I would agree with that.
and it is really the preserve of this very small, almost secret society of kind of nut jobs. And I want to bring up one of the examples you raise in your book, right on that point, which is Tal Nitzan.
Yes.
Yeah.
You want me
So-
to? It does your Israeli audience know that great story, or do you want me to?
I don't think so. I read it in your book and I was like, oh, that is just a jewel. So I'd love you, in the few moments that we have left, I'd love to get into that. And we have to finish off with Mar-a-Lago and the Trump.
Yes. Okay. So, so to your first question, I think that the general population in Israel might have a natural built-in inoculation against this nonsense, because when you are literally in a neighborhood where everybody wants to eradicate you, you don't have the luxury of wasting time in believing bullshit, because I'm worried about who's going to kill me. It's for similar reasons. If I can draw an analogy,
That could be one of the most eloquent, profound things you've ever said. Please, carry on.
well, thank you. It's not unlike the fact that women who suffer from anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder, are much more likely to come from societies of plenitude rather than societies of scarcity. And I won't get into the evolutionary reasons for that, but it's a similar argument, right? In societies where I'm worried whether I will have enough caloric intake tomorrow to survive, I can't actually afford the luxury of suppressing my reproductive potential via anorexia nervosa. So I think that's the explanation to your first point. Regarding Tal Nitzan, so she was a wood cricket, to our earlier point, a parasitized Jew, right? Because she's smarter than the rest of us. She knows that it's really Jews that are diabolical. So she, for her, I think it was her doctoral dissertation, Hebrew University, wanted to identify the rampant, the orgiastic rape of Palestinian women that the IDF soldiers engage in, okay? Because then that would allow her to ascend the hierarchy of being suicidally empathetic in academia, even in the context of a place like Israel where people should know better. Okay. So then, to her utter dismay, she finds out that not a single case of rape by IDF soldiers on Palestinian women could be uncovered. So now, if she were a honest purveyor of data, she'd say, I started off with an a priori hypothesis, I conducted the research, and then my hypothesis was falsified. But as I explained in the Parasitic Mind, if all roads lead to bigotry, then I am not open to changing my mind as a result of the data coming in. So now, how could she still maintain that IDF soldiers are truly diabolical if her hypothesis was falsified? Now, you know the punchline, but before I give the punchline, I want your viewers and listeners to pause for a minute and think if they can come up. And on the few occasions where I've discussed this on a show, most famously on Joe Rogan's podcast, #1 show in the world, no one could ever come up with the diabolical logic. Ready? Not you. I know you know the answer.
Drum roll.
Drum roll. Well, imagine how diabolical the IDF soldiers are in their othering. I love that woke term. They are so othering the Palestinian women. They view them with such contempt as subhumans that they're not even worthy of being raped. Therefore, if they had raped the Palestinian women, they would have been diabolical pigs, non-kosher pigs. And if they don't rape the women, they're diabolical, non-kosher pigs because they look at these women as not even worthy of being raped. Therefore, her hypothesis was fully protected in that she did arrive at the noble conclusion that Jews suck. Well, that's what a parasitized wood cricket does. It jumps into the water, merely committing suicide in the service of the ideological rapture that she's been parasitized with.
I know that you were honored to receive an invitation, I gather, with your family to Mar-a-Lago, where you spent the last week. The theme of the week was Make Education Great Again, I believe.
It was one, that event was one night on last Tuesday. It was Make Education Great Again. You're exactly right. And it was hosted. Some of your Israeli listeners may not know this. So are you yourself familiar with PragerU?
Of course.
Oh, okay. So PragerU, founded by 3 Jews, has been involved in the ecosystem of the battle, of ideas. And so they are trying to now incorporate their content, meaning PragerU, into the pedagogic curricula of many different states. And so under the auspices of Make Education Great Again, PragerU was hosting a gala at Mar-a-Lago. So now here's and actually, if I may, maybe it's immodest to say this, I was very honored to be recognized by name at that. So that was, and I think only 3 people were or something like that. So that was really great. But here's a personal element to that story that I think you might appreciate. So I receive a text. So my wife and I celebrated 25 years together on December 5th. And so, thank you. Which was last week while we were in Palm Beach and the Mar-a-Lago and so on. So the week before, I had gone out with one of our children to get the gift that I was going to get my wife for our anniversary. And as we are, of course, my wife wasn't with us because it's a surprise. And so I receive a text, and the text says, "Hey, Professor Sa'ad, we'd like to invite you to, Mar-a-Lago." So I look at the thing, and so I just text back. I go, "Trump's house?" And the answer comes back, "Yes." So I put it back in my pocket very coolly. And so my daughter looks at it. She goes, who was that? Was it mommy? I said, "No, it was an invitation." She goes, "Where? Invitation what? You're going to give a talk somewhere? Where are you going?" I said, "No, I was just invited to Trump's house." And she pauses. She looks at me. She goes, "Who are you, Daddy?" So this is part of the.
Hey, so now I get to share 2 fun facts.
Okay.
One is that that must have been the gala night, and you posted a photo on Twitter, X, and you were wearing this baller red velvet jacket, correct?
Indeed.
Yes,
I
you
could
were.
tell you before. I don't want to interrupt you. I want you to finish your point. But after, remind me to tell you about the story behind the red velvet suit. But go ahead.
Totally want to hear it. I also want a photo because I'd love to include it in the notes that we post online, and as well as other material. The other fun fact is you've mentioned a couple of times that I went to York University. I also went to Hebrew University, London School of Economics, and U of T Law School. But
So an underachiever.
you could, yeah, kind of. It was a generational thing. We were all like that. But when I was at York, I wrote a lot for the student newspaper there. And one of the first people I interviewed was a young Dennis Prager.
Oh my God.
I know. And
When would that have been?
this was early 80s.
Okay, wow. Yes.
Yeah, he had really, I've got to try to dig out the hard copy. It's probably completely deteriorated if I even have it. But I remember it was a really long interview and got big treatment. I was very, very proud of myself in the student paper. And he was very generous with his time then. So he's gone on to build a really quite remarkable empire, and has never flagged. What I want to talk to you about just in closing is this crazy Trump effect thing, which is of tremendous interest, not just in Israel, but I think all over the world. But man, do we feel it in Israel. People have asked me so often in North America, why should we vote for him? He's this, he's that. Why is he even good for Israel? And I'm sure you're aware, many of our listeners may not be, that probably 99.9% of Israelis love Trump.
Yes.
Trump. And that goes from the far left to the far right. There's no daylight on Donald Trump. Why? And this is what I would say to people in America when they were voting who might have been concerned with geopolitics of the region, is that Trump is perceived as being both half mad in a good way, and he's perceived as being someone who follows through, who
Yes.
makes good on his threats. And in this part of the world, as you well know, that is critical. So when Barack Obama in 2013 was wagging his finger at Assad and saying, now, if you drop chemical weapons on your population, I'm going to hit you hard. And then Assad did it, and Barack went fetal. A few years later, we have exactly the same scenario. Trump actually follows through, and the rest of the Middle East takes note. And so much of what has gone on in this region since the American election, in my view, maybe I'll write a book on it one day, is absolutely attributable to the Trump effect. Iran, as you recall, backed down from their threat to slam Israel and hard. They said, you know what? We're actually going to wait until Trump takes office, and we're going to sit down and have a chat with him. The Trump effect is extraordinary. And the only place in which it really doesn't seem to have kind of in which it really doesn't seem to be understood is in the Prime Minister's office in Canada by Justin Trudeau, who,
Yes.
but we'll put him to the side. I'd love you to share, what was the vibe? What was the mood like? That has got to be one of the hottest tickets in the world right now, to be invited to Mar-a-Lago with your family and to interact with these people who are going to do their best to rid us of these mind pathogens, these destructive trends, and restore some sense of what I would call order and sanity to this world.
Yes. Great question. So I think there are two elements to the Trump effect as relating to Jews, but we could decouple it from the Jewish thing. As relating to Israel and Jews in general, there's an element whereby he is a honey badger. So for those of you who don't know, let me explain it, because it's in chapter 8 of the Parasitic Mind. I implore people to activate their inner honey badger. Now, what that means, the reason why I chose that, again, in this case, comparison with an animal, is because the honey badger has repeatedly been ranked as the fiercest and most ferocious animal in the animal kingdom, which there are a lot of fierce animals. So for it to be king of the hill means that it has to be pretty daunting guy to cross. It's the size of a small to medium sized dog. So it's not its size, but it's its attitude. So that's 6 adult lions. And I say 6 because there's footage where you see one honey badger being approached and attacked by 6 adult lions in Africa. They back down. How is that possible? Because it is absolutely insanely ferocious and fierce. Part of it is just signaling, but part of it is it comes through, to your point, to your earlier point, right? And therefore, we've evolved the mechanisms to say, is it worth my while to actually test this thing? Or let me go elsewhere and find another prey, because this guy seems insane and I don't want to mess with him, right? And so when I implore people to activate their inner honey badger, I'm not saying be physically violent. What I'm saying is, if you have a set of beliefs that you can clearly articulate that are foundational to your principles, you have to be a honey badger and defend them. Don't recoil. Don't suck your thumb. Don't be a castrated fool. Don't be lobotomized. Fight, right? Or as Trump said, fight, 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 right? So I think that one factor that people resonate with Trump is that he is a honey badger. Second factor is he is authentic to a fault. I recently did a clip on my channel where I said, what do Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, and Donald Trump have in common? And my answer was authenticity, right? I've gotten to know Elon quite well. I've spent some time with him. The richest guy in the history of the world is just an authentic guy. You get to his house, we hug it out, we have a 4-hour chat. Nothing could be lovelier. Zero pretense, just authentic. Trump is authentic. At times to a fault, right? Where he doesn't modulate what he says. He's not diplomatic, but he's authentic. Joe Rogan, who's a personal friend, I've been on his show many times, is authentic. He doesn't modulate. He doesn't equivocate. He's not Justin Trudeau. He's not Barack Obama. He's not nearly all of the Western leaders that have destroyed the West over the past 20 plus years. And so that's part of the Trump magic. As relating specifically to Jews, I think that he is very Judeophilic, whether it be by the fact that his son-in-law is Jewish and therefore his daughter converted to Judaism and so on. So he has the reflex of being very pro-Israel, right? The Abraham Accords, the moving the embassy to Jerusalem and all that. So for all of these reasons, Israelis get it and say he's great. Now, to answer your question of how was the mood at Mar-a-Lago, it's as if people were floating on a clouds of positivity. Now, you may say, well, that's obvious. You're at Mar-a-Lago. It's Trump's that he just won. But it was more than that. It was that everyone had been weighed down existentially by endless woke parasitic stuff. Now, some of us didn't care. I spoke my mind no matter what. But for most people, they were afraid. Am I allowed to say that men don't menstruate? Can I say that men don't bear children? Is it okay to be against affirmative action? So for all sorts of reasons, people were very, very weighed down. And suddenly this savior comes along. And so it was this Caligula party at Mar-a-Lago. I mean, without all the obscenity. I don't mean Caligula and that's, I just mean...
Oh, that's too bad. I was ready with a whole new line of questioning.
No, none of that.
I was like, wait, I waited an hour for that?
No, it was really, everybody was happy, joyful. And it's not just because they were at Mar-a-Lago, it's because they were just pleased to have a sense of normalcy return. Everybody at that Mar-a-Lago exactly could answer the question, what is a woman? Which the most recent justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was unable to do. So that kind of gives you a sense of the mood. And now do you want me to answer, or not answer, but to tell you the story about the red velvet suit?
I can't sleep tonight if you don't tell me the story.
All right, here it goes. Now,
of course I want to hear the story. The story of the red velvet suit. Dr. Gad Sa'ad, please.
All right, here we go. So one of the I'm filled with gratitude at the types of people I get to meet, yourself included, that otherwise I would never have had the chance for our lives to intersect were it not that I was, so much in the public eye. So I can't remember which show it was. I was on some show where I said that I've always had a fantasy that I would have this beautiful home, invite my closest friends, and to their surprise, I would go up on a podium and state the following: ladies and gentlemen, the Stylistics. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Stylistics are an old soul group that's part of a type of musical genre called the Philly Sound. I've gotten to know the lead singer of the Stylistics. This guy was singing in my ear when I didn't even know English. I didn't speak English. We subsequently became friends through the magic of all these connections. And as I told this fantasy, I said, and of course, when I go up to introduce them, I would have to be wearing the red velvet suit. And that's it. That was the story. Fast forward a year or two later, I can't remember exactly when it was, a very, very highbrow, bespoke, tailor custom-made company out of Toronto, I think, reaches out to me and says, "We are huge fans of yours. We know about your velvet suit story. We would like to come to Montreal, measure you, and build you that suit." And so that red velvet suit stems from that company in an incredible act of kindness and generosity. And I won't even mention how much it would cost were it not a gift. And so that red velvet suit came as a result of those folks coming to Montreal and dressing me that way.
Amazing. So now I just have to ask before we wrap, are there red velvet pants?
No, so it's a red velvet suit with
jacket.
jacket. I'm sorry, jacket, excuse me, with a white thing with a black bow tie and black pants. But now here's the part.
Thank you, because I was starting to see red velvet pants and it wasn't going.
No, it's not.
Okay.
And
All right.
when you open the jacket, the lining of the jacket, they said we can do whatever you want with the inside lining that captures anything you want. So when you open my jacket, there are paintings, but reproduced to perfection, actually by a fan, a different story, of our two Belgian shepherds. So now they passed away, but we had two Belgian shepherds. By the way, the Israeli military uses Belgian shepherds because you don't want to mess with Belgian shepherds. And by the way, their names, given my Arabic background, the male was named Amar. Amar means moon, but it also means great beauty. You're beautiful like the moon. And then the girl, the female, was named Samra. Samra means dark one because she had a black mask. Her muzzle was a black mask. And so if you open my super fancy red velvet jacket that I wore at Mar-a-Lago, you have immortalized inside my lining are two Belgian shepherds.
I love it. I love it. And you got to keep a sense of humor all the time. In fact, I'm going to be meeting soon with the OKITs, the canine unit with the IDF, which, as you know, is super, super important here. And another sort of fun, weird fact is that until the mid-'80s, the fact that a canine unit existed in Israel was a state secret because of the Holocaust and the trauma of German shepherds, not Belgian shepherds.
Yes.
So, yeah, it was a big deal when that became public. So stay tuned. I'll let you know when that podcast is coming.
Oh, wow. Please. And they may not know who I am, but whomever handles the Belgian shepherds and the IEF, tell them hello on my part. If there's ever any proof of the divine, they come in the package called Belgian shepherds.
Dr. Gad Sa'ad, we could do this all night. I could, but I actually have to take my daughter for dinner. And it's just been a beyond pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mom.
Thank you so much for coming on State of Tel Aviv, and I hope we have you back in the future.
Anytime. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to ring the bell, subscribe, like, love, comment. We'll be bringing more content to this YouTube channel very soon. So we'll see you then. Please check out our podcasts and articles also at stateoftelaviv.com. Have a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever holiday you celebrate at this time of year. And to all, best wishes for a peaceful holiday from the team at State of Tel Aviv and beyond.